welcome back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn. I am your host, Michael Grace, and today I am joined by Gary Melling. Gary is President and CEO of Acquired Insights Incorporated. It's a strategic management consulting and systems aggregation firm focused on delivering applied artificial intelligence and machine learning, predictive analytics, cybersecurity, humanoid robots, chatbots, and 3D avatar business solutions, resulting in immediate, measurable, and scalable value for our clients through better real-time business decision support. That's a whole lot, Gary. Thank you for taking the time and joining the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure.
So is there anything that you'd like to add to the intro, maybe about yourself or about Acquired Insights that wasn't captured there?
Well, thank you. That was a very kind introduction. I think maybe maybe a minute on myself.
Sure.
I was brought up in a military family, and we traveled a lot. So I was in I think we counted 17 schools and lived in about 7 countries and so on. So it was very eclectic. Um, Now, having said that, one of the things you learn in an environment like that is how to deal with change. And so it's probably a natural progression that over the years I really became mindful about what change means and what does it mean to different people and how do you get them to see a mission or a goal the same way, and more importantly, how do you get to align them so that you can get the productivity out of whatever program or project you're working on. So I come to this really quite honestly. Initially, my background was in electronic systems. I was program director at Combat Systems Engineering Division for the Navy, and then moved on to other things. Did consulting on Wall Street with Accenture and Y2K preparation for ERP systems, and then post that built out an electronic HR line of business at Computer Sciences Corporation. So since then, I've been a serial entrepreneur. I have a partner in Acquired Insights, Tracy Feber. Tracy is in Saskatchewan, Canada, and I'm in Ontario. So we're on the phone an awful lot and doing these kinds of chats. But it's really good to be here. So thank you for your kind invitation.
Awesome. Thank you for taking the time. In that intro, there was a tidbit that's just on fire across the internet as people are trying to figure out what Mark Zuckerberg is doing, what the Metaverse is, and and then Satya added to the fire with he tweeted out this really cool video, and he was talking about how we're all going to go to work as avatars, and we're all gonna gonna virtually work together in a kind of this artificial environment, which I always say seems really close to like Ready Player One, or if you've read Ready Player Two. 3D avatars are kind of all the rage. What's kind of a business application as people are thinking about these avatars, and do I need one, and should I have one, and how do businesses use them?
A great question, a great topic. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just back up a little bit and talk about just from a very high level AI, because AI I think is a segue into these kinds of avatars and the kinds of data that are used to help the avatars be as omnipresent as we believe and hope that they may be. So a lot of times what happens, and I'm going to date myself a little bit because back in the early 1980s, I was involved in using technology in military applications. And in the early 80s, 83, 84, I was working on designing and doing limited prototypes of technology that would put basically a digital box on an airplane, on a US jet or some other kind of equipment, flying over Red Square and at 30,000 feet and being able to read Pravda newspaper over the shoulder of someone. So that was back in the early 80s. That was my introduction to that kind of sort of top secret, confidential kind of security. And I know that, if we take a look at technology today, basically what I was working on was a precursor to the kind of technology that we all take for granted now, like Google Earth. So being able to fly, and now, mind you, it's not as interactive as the technologies that we're talking about with the avatars, But that was going on back in the early 1980s. So first of all, military applications lead this by a long way, often by decades, before there's more of a commercial or even a private consumer application for this. So I don't pretend to understand everything that's going on with military research right now, but I can assure you I've seen snippets of it, and it's very, very, very sophisticated. So let's kind of fast forward to where we are today. So if we think of avatars, um, no matter what we're talking about, avatars, chatbots, robotics, they're all bits and bots. They're all, miniature electromechanical sensors. They're pneumatics, hydraulics, electronics. There's a lot of technology that goes into it. And while there's a fair bit of hardware often, we're now seeing a lot of the transition move from that kind of hardware to more of a pure play in software. So you're seeing it on a screen. You're not actually having a humanoid robot. Like, for example, we had several discussions with David Hansen from Hansen Robotics, and if your audience is familiar with the robot Sophia, we entered into many discussions with David and basically fleshed out an agreement that allowed us to work with Hansen Robotics to take a look at bringing Sophia into North America in two industries specifically. One is healthcare and one is financial services. And I'm certainly not going to say and tell any stories out of school, but one of the challenges we realized very early on in those discussions is that when you're starting to talk about humanoid robotics, whether they're little 3 foot, kind of SoftBank, or whether they're the full blown Sophia from Hansen Robotics, one of the real challenges is manufacturing to scale. So, for example, a limited production run of Sophia could be 10 robots or 12 robots, and that could take 18 months before you went from the time you start the production until the time a robot is ready to be interfaced with the public in some way, shape, or form. Well, that timeline, the way technology is moving so quickly, that timeline just isn't functional for a lot of applications. So here would be a quick example. If we had a call from a retail bank anywhere in North America and they said, well, we'd love to have a Sophia, but we have 5,000 locations. Well, there's no way production could ramp up to deliver on those robots. So we would reserve those robots for very, very specific things where there's manual dexterity and other things required other than a three-dimensional face on a two-dimensional screen, which is what the avatars and many of the holograms and so on that we're talking about. So it's a whole other leap in technology, and with it comes the ability to scale. So now if we got a call from the bank, literally within 30 days, we could have 5,000 instances of that avatar implemented in a bank. So that's the difference between the humanoid robotics and more of the avatars. But let's get a little bit into what's happening with avatars. And you made reference to Satya's presentation on the avatars and Mark Zuckerberg and so on. This is a very, very intriguing, sexy kind of way to entice people to do all kinds of things. But let's not forget that there is real vulnerability. If we, for example, let me just back up a little bit. With many, many people working from home now, I just want to talk about cybersecurity for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
There may be situations, and I know there are, in fact, a large number of situations where students are not physically in a classroom. They're working remotely from home. They're taking their online classes and so on. And in many instances, there are situations where a family only has one computer. And that computer is quite probably, if they only have one, that probably is from one of the parents' workplaces. So let's think about this for a minute. So now we have a corporation, a company, some entity, government or otherwise, that has provided a digital asset to an employee. That employee takes the asset home with the full intention of using it for work. But oh, by the way, my son or daughter needs to sign in. We don't have any other resource. They sign into the local school board servers, and all of a sudden, now they are wide open for rampant attacks because public school board servers are notorious for a lot of phishing and so on. So let's take that a step further now. Now, if you have, as many of your listeners have, I'm sure, been listening to the news recently, and remember, these are only the stories that hit the press. There are hundreds, thousands more that never make it. But if we take a look at Colonial Pipeline, if we take a look at some of the large big brand credit card companies with breaches, if we take a look at the Canada Revenue Agency, the gun registry, We can go on and on and on. There, just Google cybersecurity breaches 2021, hundreds, thousands of them, and these are only the ones that get reported. So, where I'm going with this is, as soon as you have a technology that's sexy and it holds out the promise that there will be massive improvements in productivity, I think that we really need to kind of like the Wizard of Oz, pull back the curtain and take a look at who's behind the curtain. So, in this particular situation, if we take a look at how these breaches to cybersecurity have happened, remember that the good guys need to get it right all the time. The bad guys only need to get it right once. Okay.
Hmm.
And your organization is in a world of hurt. So we know for a fact that, and this becomes from our cybersecurity solutions from an enterprise perspective and so on, we know that from the moment a breach occurs until the moment it is detected by an IT team in a corporation, on average is about 191 days. That's over 6 months that
Wow.
breach has been sitting in your system. And the way I liken it to kind of leaving one day to go to the store, and while you're gone, someone has the keys to your house and they move into your attic. And you don't know they're there. And you leave the house many times a day. And when you're gone, they know you're gone and they come down and they start rummaging through all your stuff and they decide what they're going to do and take and so on. And they hear you coming back and then they go back up into the attic. It's kind of a clumsy analogy, but I think it represents kind of what's going on during that 6 or 7 month period. We also know that about 95, 96% of all of those breaches occur through email.
Mm.
So again, if you're in a situation where you have a student working from home using a corporate asset on a public server, quasi-public server, and these things are open to all kinds of attacks. It's not a good situation. So let's now apply this in the context of the avatars. Okay, so with avatars, there's a tremendous amount of technology. We talked previously about structured data, unstructured, semi structured, behavioral data. All of these data sources are unique and different for very different reasons. So, for example, many corporations with ERP systems are by and large, and I'm being very general in this statement, but most corporations, when they think about their strategy, their annual report, their quarterly earnings and reporting and compliance and Sarbanes-Oxley, all those kinds of things, their annual report is supposed to be a summary of how all of that worked and their hope for the future and a heads up to investors and so on. That's a public facing document. And so when you take a look at those kinds of documents, you're seeing kind of the world in almost a perfect view of how the
Hmm.
company sees itself. And yes, they've been audited by third parties, et cetera. So the numbers we're led to believe are fair. But where is this going? So if you have these ERP systems and you've got all of this various disparate sources of data, you're only amplifying and increasing the opportunities for breaches. So now when I take a look at the avatars that they're looking at coming up, there's like I use the word sexiness to them that will entice people. It's like mind candy. People want to get involved. They want to do it. They want to try it. The platforms are there. I'm going to suggest that while there are some very positive and utopian kinds of outcomes from these things, let's not have a blind eye to all the nefarious activities that can happen too. So I think what we're seeing effectively is a transition from humans doing work over the last few decades to technology assisting humans. Now, recently, we've been into robotic process automation, which takes business processes and automates them and removes things like double or triple sign offs for authority and things like that, all the places where non productive activities were happening. And now, what we're seeing is that there's a move to go from pure code software that automated those processes to seeing where we can insert a humanoid image that represents a person actually doing that work. Now, I think that's an interim step. I think long term, whether it's Meta, whether it's some of the ERP solutions, and we work with all of these different technologies. But I think what we're going to see over time is that while there will be some very, very positive things that come out of it, in the short term, there are going to be some real nefarious activities. So if you imagine, I remember in 1990 attending a conference on the World Wide Web. Big splash, big deal. And, we wondered if this is going to be a fad. Is this like a new toaster, or is this actually something really that's going to fundamentally change society? And of course, it was the latter. But with that came the dark web. With that came the opportunity for the dark web to be used for human trafficking, sex trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking. And now, of course, it's so sophisticated. If I was a less than honorable individual and I wanted to commit a crime against ABC Corporation, I can go onto the dark web and I can outsource that hit. I can split the proceeds with whoever's actually doing the work. And recently, actually, there was a situation in Russia where some of the bad guys got into a bit of a bun fight over commissions and who was going to get what. And the site was actually shut down for a few months until they sorted it out and then restarted. So if you take a look at that historical note with the dark web and the real web, the web that folks like you and I use on a regular basis to whether it's to shop for something or to inquire about a company or a product or service, there's a lot of nefarious activity that comes out with anything new because the bad guys are always trying to find a way to exploit it, and they can do it faster because they don't play by the same rules. They're not really too concerned about the CAN-SPAM Act or ITAR or any of these things. They're going to do what they're going to do. So I think that's a byproduct of what we're seeing. And if we try to apply that to a real life example, most of your audience is probably familiar with a lot of the deep fake videos that have come out with someone's face it looks real, the words coming out of their mouth look real, the mouthing of the words looks real for all intents and purposes. Like you're really wondering, was that bogus or was that a real video? Now imagine having access to people's avatars
Mhm.
and being able to use their digital persona, their digital profile for nefarious purposes. I might be in a situation where someone uses my profile, if I had one, a digital profile like that, and could insert me in videos, and that video could be used in testimony in court. Well, I wasn't there, that wasn't me. That was only a representation of me, and it wasn't a representation of me that was controlled by me. So what happens in these situations is the technology often leads, and then the illegal traffic follows very quickly, but then the regulators are way behind. And it's very frustrating for the regulators because they're trying to do an honest day's work. They're looking to make a difference. They want to catch the bad guys. But there are so many internal politics between the regulators who has governance over this and over that, and well, what about this chapter and that clause and this line, and they get bogged down in a lot of the process and administration around these activities, which I think causes further delay and frustration on their part. So just some off the top of my head thoughts about some of these avatars.
That's yeah, it's good caution, right? I know that we all get excited, and the industry does a good job of gamifying us into the excitement of avatars and the metaverse, and it's great to just kind of remember that there are risks, right? When you wade into those
Mhm.
waters that you can't see the bottom of.
Mhm.
That's awesome. You mentioned a couple of things around data and unstructured data, and companies. These are all kind of words I think that companies are still trying to figure out, right? They tend to lag, and when we say, "Oh, how are you leveraging your unstructured data?" They're like, "No, we have file folders and such. We have structured data. Like we've got SharePoint," and I'm like, that's not structured data." So maybe if you could talk a little bit about what unstructured data kind of is, first of all, and then why should companies maybe care about it and leverage it?
Okay, great. Um, well, basically, we have a few different categories, and I won't go down a rabbit hole, but I'll talk about structured, unstructured, and behavioral. Perhaps that's the easiest way. So think of structured data when you have a form and that form has different fields in it, and you're entering a first name, a last name, and so on. That's structured data. If you have an Excel spreadsheet, that's structured data. If you have a database in some of the other large database applications, that is structured data. And with structured data, the challenge is that in order to get a really good answer, you need to have a really good question. So your question needs to be articulate. It needs to be very, very specific because the system is only a system. It's going to bring back whatever you ask. And if you ask something that you think is right but doesn't really hit the nail on the head, you won't necessarily get the right answer you're looking for. Um, so structured data, again, it has to be used a certain way, but it is just bits and bytes, rows and columns, and that's pretty much it. Now, if you look at unstructured data, think of, for example, of a mobile device. So on a mobile device, you have the ability to write notes. You can take a picture. You can take a video. These are unstructured data sources. And unstructured data is much more challenging to interrogate. If you want to ask a question of unstructured data, the way you not only capture that data, so for example, if you one of the challenges is how do you make sense out of a combination of an eclectic unstructured data set. So you might have a handwritten note, you might have a photograph, you might have a video, and you might have an audio tape. So, but they're all relative to the topic that you're trying to get an answer on. So somehow you have to take those disparate forms of data from hard copy on a piece of paper to the photograph and so on. And what's typically being done is you have to find a way to convert that to something that can be read and understood. And so unstructured data takes many different forms, but think of it as very eclectic. And there are technologies that are used, we use to get to the bottom of interpreting that technology. So for example, looking at a video, if we had 7 seconds of video, that would be an unstructured data set. But what we would also do is analyze frame by frame. Now they become still pictures and they become easier to analyze. Handwritten notes, we can take a look at a variety of different ways to analyze them. Voice recordings, the same. We can also get into sentiment analysis. So it's not just what's being said, it's the tone. It's what can we infer from the tone about the state, the psychological state of the individual. I'm just using some very high level examples here. And then I think the real untapped category is behavioral data. Now, we're seeing, of course, Google and Amazon using behavioral data. If you take a look at Netflix and so on, they're using very simple things like people who watch this also watch that. Or you order something on Amazon and they see that you like this and you've been using Amazon for purchasing things over a period of time. So it's begun to create a behavioral profile for you and of you. And as a result of that, it's then able to, depending on the accuracy of the algorithms, predict what other interests you may have, all in the interest in selling you more. It's a transactional motivation. Now, the challenge with behavioral data is that it's often inferred. Structural data is just that. It's very structured. It's there or it's not. It's a one or a zero. Unstructured data takes many eclectic forms, and there are tools that can help interpret that. Behavioral data is much more following the activities, the actions of the individual, and setting up enough patterns as examples to over time be able to accurately predict, that's the hope, to accurately predict what their next move might be. So we call it it's NBA, next best action. What's the likely outcome of what that person will do next? So those are kind of the things that go into a lot of AI. And back to your question, most corporations again use not only, but more importantly, they typically use more of structured data than anything else. That structured data is to take a look at profitability, to take a look at revenue, supply chain, all kinds of things. But because it's largely only structured data, and only now are we getting into commercial scalable utilization of unstructured and behavioral data. And it's being used a lot in financial services, let's say, for establishing whether or not a person's a good credit risk, et cetera. So there are many, many applications of it that are underway right now, but it's not as ubiquitous. I mean, I've seen organizations say that, oh, we just adopted a brand new program and we're going to be using artificial intelligence. And truth be known, the organization did not acquire the application, but what they did do is hire 300 more people to try to get out from behind the backlog. So when I say the man behind the curtain, and like there's a lot of smoke and mirrors that goes on, and From a consumer perspective, it's largely buyer beware, because a lot of times the devil's in the details. And when you sign up for a new app or a new software, or you want to do something, you'll always often see, well, our terms and conditions have recently changed, and how many people just click through and they don't read anything, and they don't, they're really not reading it at their peril. So we do need to pay more attention to those kinds of things.
I, I love it. I appreciate walking through the definition because I think people hear unstructured data and they don't really know what it is, and definitely I don't think I think they go structured, unstructured. And so I really appreciate the behavioral data explanation as well, because I do think that's a piece that oftentimes we kind of overlook. Um, when we look at other things, right, that are hitting businesses, gone are the days of crystal reports and just having these farms of reports, right? I went into one customer and they were really proud. They're like, we have 800 reports. And I'm like, wow. And they're like, isn't that good? I'm like, no, that's highly ineffective. That's
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And we ran all kinds of reports to say, like, hey, no one's ran this report in 7 years. So you're having a report that's completely not, like, it's irrelevant. Or people run the reports and they're like, no, they're run every day. Does anyone read them? Well, it's meant for so and so. So and so doesn't even work here anymore. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
we can probably stop that report. So reporting has migrated a little bit. People have cleaned up reports and such. But now we're entering an age of, yet another buzz term, predictive analytics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, can you maybe compare and contrast predictive analytics to reporting, and what are the differences?
Sure. I guess that probably the easiest way to create contrast and comparison between reports and predictive analytics. Think of reports as basically they're historical. No matter what you're doing, and even if whether it's a historical from a year ago or a minute ago, those reports are historical. Um, when you think of predictive analytics, what you're doing is you're using the historical data as a baseline to understand what the influences were, to understand how you got to where you are today. But the power of predictive analytics is that they're able to infer based on other variables and the identification and elimination of things like biases and so on. They're able to take a look at what will be a likely outcome in a particular scenario. So you can change the scenarios, and with predictive analytics, the outcomes, will likely change, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So that can cause a whole other line of inquiry around, well, we changed these variables a lot, and there was very little change in the outcome. Why is that? And so often you can use those predictive analytics not only to include historical, to take a look at the current situation and to infer where you're going. You can also take an output of what you think will happen in the future and reverse engineer it. In electronics, in circuit analysis and so on, there are various techniques that are used to do the same thing, Fourier analysis and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
and when you take that approach, if you start with something and you get to the end and you have a report with a supposed logical conclusion, the only way you really know if that conclusion is going to be highly accurate is if you can reverse engineer it and get back to the data set that you originally had, if this is making sense. So
Mm-hmm.
otherwise it's predictive analytics, but it's highly speculative. And what you want to be able to do is do the validation on the back end to make sure that they align. And that's where there's a fair bit of work. There's a, you know, it's there's so much math involved. And while there is clearly, between coding and mathematics and assumptions and calculations and statistics and analysis, those are all the science part of it, but there's also the art. And the art is where really, I think having experience and knowing how to read the baseline data and merge and meld it with your experiences to know, well, okay, I know that that's probably how it looks, but what we should do is maybe approach this from a different perspective, just to validate that we think that that is in fact the true outcome. So I wouldn't want to lose the art of this as well, because the art is often that little swirl on the ice cream cone that makes it all, presentable, and make it fit and look and taste and everything the way it should. So it's important, but it's not a huge exercise, but it is important.
When I talk to customers about reporting, I'm always like, hey, this is great. We got all these reports, and month end, right? The word month end is always associated with reporting. And at month end, we do all this crazy crunching of numbers, and we either did or didn't hit our targets, right? And people are like, oh yeah, we're off, or this is this, and they analyze all these numbers. And I'm like, why don't we, to your previous point around, right, asking a question like, what are we trying to solve with this, right? Like, what are you trying to, well, we've got to make sure that over time stays in alignment. Okay, well, why are we waiting till month end to do that, right? Why don't we swim upstream? What system has that information, right? And then why don't we empower those line managers to know, like, hey, you shouldn't schedule this person or bring this person in because it's going to affect your overtime. Instead, give them some tools to model maybe a scenario where
Mhm.
they can bring in other resources that wouldn't cause an overtime situation. And enable the business, take reporting kind of upstream to the point of decision making, and give them the tools and the techniques that quite often sometimes are even available within the very ERP that you happen to be using. You're
Mhm.
just not leveraging it correctly.
Mhm.
Um, and you wait till month end, and then you go, oh, rats, I missed it. And I'm like, I have little to no interest in month end reporting. I think it's just this crazy process that historically we've all gone through because technology wasn't at the level it needed to be to enable a different scenario where we're managing our reporting on
Mhm.
the day to day as it's actually occurring.
Mhm.
Um,
Agreed. Yeah.
lots of movement in the world of ERP, right? If we look 7, 8 years back, right, the
Mhm.
PeopleSoft split and Workday enters the market and makes a big splash in the human capital management world, and everybody's like, "Ooh, shiny object," right? Everybody runs over and looks at Workday. Um, but all the ERP platforms are evolving. Even the big giants like SAP, right? They've really gotten into. They have their own RPA product. They've really
Mhm.
kind of embraced the AI space. They've all kind of matured, evolved, transitioned. It's kind of exciting, right? I tell my GL accountants that I talk to, I say it's for the first time in a long time, it's exciting to be a GL accountant. As exciting as that can possibly be, because technology in the ERP space, the software aspect, I feel has kind of finally modernized, if you will, and has some cool features and functionality and things to help revolutionize that technology and those jobs. What do you see as some of the trends? You guys spend a lot of time in these bigger kind of ERPs. What do you maybe see as some trends that are exciting around ERP?
Oh, great question. Let's maybe take a look at a couple of examples um, that are not ERP companies necessarily, but and they use ERP systems. If we take a look at the Amazon, the Microsoft of the world, um, I think it's generally accepted practice and directional thinking. To your point, that we've had these historical implementations, the old R3s and so on, and that's basically originally been all on-premise implementations. And
Mhm.
then we transitioned to a hybrid, which would be a combination of on-prem and cloud. And now, of course, there is the move to go to full cloud. Well, uh, I think if we take a look at what does the cloud mean? I mean, if I were to kind of sum it into one sentence, basically what you're saying is that you're going to put your systems and your data on someone else's computer.
I love that you just said that because I just did a whole episode where somebody was like, we're doing transformation, we're moving to the cloud. And I'm like, you realize moving to the cloud is not transformational, right? You could give me your data and I'll put it in my garage. Theoretically, you're in the cloud because you're just on my computer in my
Right.
garage, and there's no transformation there. And they're like, oh, and it was just this like thought provoking moment. So I'm glad to hear somebody else say, going to the cloud is not some transformational. Your organization's now somehow magically different. I love it. Please continue.
I
Thank you. Sorry, I
agree,
just
and
had
but
to
I'll
put
tell
that
you.
in there.
Well, I think there is massive transformation that comes out of the move to the cloud, but it's not necessarily from the technology. To your point, so let's go back and kind of revisit a theme we started with the avatars and so on. And again, originally humans were in the role of doing jobs, and then we used technology to assist them. And now that technology is becoming more visible with avatars and chatbots and things like that. If we kind of go fast forward, while moving your data to someone else's computer is really what the cloud is about, let's also remember that data storage effectively is quite inexpensive. It's come way, way down in price compared to what it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. And so this is one reason why organizations move to the cloud. And by doing so, they have less of the on site maintenance and all the other things that they need to do. They still have to pay for those things, but they do it with a host and a provider, and it's all packaged. And basically, it's a box they can check and put to the side, and they feel comfortable about it. Now, they don't always necessarily consider the security implications or other things, but let's assume from a pure digital perspective and moving your data from on-prem or hybrid to the cloud is more of it's not a transformation, it's a digital exercise, it's a migration. The first problem that most organizations face when they go through an initiative like this is prior to wanting to do it, they've been told over time and they believe that they have to boil the ocean and harvest all the data that has ever existed since the beginning of time, right? So now you've got this massive repository of data that's being stored inexpensively, and you're looking at moving to the cloud, and inadvertently, a lot of organizations, well, just move the whole thing. Well, no, that's a waste of time, money, effort, energy. It's
Amen.
begging for rework. It's begging for project failure. It's fraught with peril, right? So part of the problem is understanding which data is being used and how it's being used. When was it last used? When was it coded if it's custom code? So I'll give you a quick example. One of the tools that we've brought to market recently is a tool that takes a look at SAP. And this tool. It's not as though we're an outlier. SAP has brought this into their RISE program. This tool has received a referral from the office of the CTO at SAP. So it's been used in over 1,800 SAP assessments already across 15 industries. So we've got a tremendous number of growing use cases and so on. I only mention that because what I want to do is say where this is going. So if you take a look at some of the technologies and the bits and bytes that are being used and I'm not picking on SAP. SAP is a fabulous company and a wonderful product. And so is Oracle and all the other big, large names that you referenced. But the challenge is often how do we identify which data needs to be migrated? Because if we were to do it all, instead of taking 1 year, it might take 5 years. Instead of costing $10 million, maybe it'll cost $100 million. And I'm just throwing these numbers out as illustrative examples. So the challenge is to know which data to migrate. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to understand what your system looks like. And too often, keep in mind, if you're no matter what solution you're using, Oracle, SAP, any other large system, chances are, unless you were with the company as the CTO from the beginning 30 years ago or 20 years ago, there are knowledge gaps in your understanding about what that system is, whether it's data, modules, whatever it is, who has what licenses. And so the problem is that most organizations, when they think about digital transformation or moving to the cloud or whatever the topic is, they're trying to build a new house on an old foundation.
Hmm.
That foundation is crumbling, and their expectations is that they're going to have a new improved house, and it's only a matter of time before things start to fall and crack and crumble and so on. So the tool that we're bringing to market now Typically, an SAP as is assessment, if facilitated by a consulting firm, would take between 1 and 2 years, could cost between $1 and $7 million, and we're able to do this in one day. So, and we go down to the deepest levels. So why is this important? It's important because when you take a look at the opportunity to control your costs for that data migration, or to move to the cloud, now you're actually working with the data that you should be working with. And through that process, you can also identify when custom code was created it, who's used it. To your point, so this report was created for so and so, but they no longer work here. Well, there are so many ways that these projects can go sideways. So
Mm-hmm.
what we do is we come in, we do a business continuity risk analysis, we take care of change readiness assessment. We understand not just the bits and bytes, but in the end, it's going to be the people that have to live with this, whatever it is. And you want those people to understand with clarity what the mission is. And you have to be able to answer the questions. If I go down this road, how will it affect me? Will I still have a job? Will I still get paid for the same things? Will my scope of responsibilities change? If so, will I be asked to do more? If I'm asked to do more, will I get more pay? There's just these are human questions. This is not about any particular technology. This is the human condition. And so we have to not just think about the bits and bytes. We need to really understand and be able to communicate effectively and efficiently all of these other elements of a transformation so that we have the right people signing up and agreeing and supporting what it is we're going to do, as opposed to those passive resistors who just sit as outliers and are of the opinion, I was here before you came, I'm going to be here after you're gone, I can just wait it out. Well, business isn't waiting for that. The technology is moving so fast. You can very easily get kind of left in the margins if you're not involved in some way. But it's important to be involved the right way. And that's why we really address the organizational and the people side of change as well.
I really love that, right? I use a term that I call stuck at start. And I preach it to all my customers. I said, before you just get sold a bill of goods by the software vendors, because, right, important to remember, software vendors only care about selling you the next version, right? That's how they get license revenue. That's how the salespeople get paid. They're your friends and taking you to lunch and doing all these cool things so that you feel comfortable so they can sell you stuff so that they can get paid. That is their real motive. Yeah, sure. There's some that might actually care about your business and believe that some of their tools can solve your problems. Totally agree. Um, but then everybody's like, oh, we got to hurry up. We got to get started. And there's oftentimes this artificial cadence that gets put in place, and you come out of the starting blocks without this foundational assessment of the where you are, of the people element. You don't have a good plan. You don't have good sponsors. You haven't communicated well across the organization. You don't have buy-in. And these are the projects, that go sideways pretty quickly out of the gate, and often take much longer, cost way more, often fail and stop. We had a customer that tried an SAP implementation. They said, SAP is a horrible product. It doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. I said, wow, somebody should call SAP and tell them that their product doesn't work because they've got tens of thousands of customers that are using it. I mean, we should call them and let them know. And they said, oh, that's a good point. Yeah, it failed here. I'm like, well, if it failed here and it worked everywhere else, guess what the problem was, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's a hard message to get people to understand, but thinking before you act often
Mm-hmm.
leads to a better result. And thinking about your people that you're going to ask to go on this journey, I love what you said about just the data, right? And doing that analysis around everybody, the standard answer whenever I ask people like, oh, how much data are we converting? 7 years. Why? Like, why do we need to bring that to the cloud? Well, that's our regulatory requirement. Your regulatory requirement is that you have access to the data. The
Mm-hmm.
data doesn't need to be in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you bring all that garbage with you that you just told me isn't cleaned up, isn't this, isn't that? You just told me all the problems with it. And then you're like, hey, we have the shiny new thing. Let's cram all this crap into that shiny new thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of sit there and look at people and go, are you listening to what you're saying? Because
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't make sense to me,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just, you're fraught with errors in your logic. So I call it stuck at start, where I try to get folks to really sit down and let's consider all the aspects. We do an offering called a pre-planning that's really all about let's plan for the plan to go to these large implementations because they're oftentimes a multi-year journey. They're millions, if not tens of millions of dollars.
Mhm.
Um, we do a lot of work in healthcare, and there's a lot of these EHRs, and it's the same thing. They get started on these journeys. They're trying to do Epic. They're trying to do Cerner or Allscripts or and or McKesson. I don't know anyone's implementing McKesson. More people are migrating from McKesson, I guess, these days. But they just don't have a plan, and you're just kind of like, what are we doing? And they just can't
Mhm.
answer the most basic questions. And um, so I just loved everything that you just said around especially highlighting the people element of let's make sure that we have a good plan around our people.
Mhm. Well, and I think to coin a phrase, I think we're in violent agreement. About how important that is. I know that when I was with Accenture many years ago and flying in to do work in New York City on Wall Street for ERP implementations, and a lot of it had to do really with the change management side of things. Um, it was shocking how many people made assumptions about things, assumptions that weren't validated, assumptions that had not been shared, assumptions that were not made. We had a saying is that start with the end in mind, right? Like have a clear vision of what the outcome of all your effort is going to be, and then reverse engineer it. And that kind of minimizes a lot of twos and fro's and distractions. But yeah, I absolutely agree that that people side is so critically important. I saw many projects. Actually, I did an informal analysis. We had a tool when I was in the firm. Fabulous tool. It was called the Knowledge Exchange. And the Knowledge
Mm.
Exchange was a repository. Back then, it was in Lotus Notes. So we were very sophisticated, very well organized, and think of it as knowledge management at its finest. And I'm not pretending that the other big firms didn't have it. I think all of them have some flavor of this. But what it allowed me to do is if I was being put as a project lead on a particular project, I could go into the knowledge exchange and with a few variables, I could search for projects that looked like the project I was about to roll on. So this is using structured data because it's a
Mhm.
repository of historical events. And I could interrogate it with the right questions, and it might give me back 20, 200 different projects that the firm had worked on, and I could hone it down into a short list. What I discovered is that more often than not, if I took a look at projects that were determined to be successful versus unsuccessful, and unsuccessful, that's a big wide gray line. I mean, there's abject failure at the one end, and then there's
Mhm.
things that could have been tweaked a bit to be all they could be. And so, with
Absolutely.
that context in mind, what I discovered is that, and this is more empirical with some historical references, but not a pure scientific study. What I discovered was that those projects that committed about 22 to 24% of their total budget to full cycle organizational change management were virtually guaranteed to be successful. And anything less than that, if you tried to cut corners on the change management, the people side of it, and that didn't mean that they weren't cutting corners on the technology as well. But if you didn't on the technology and you just cut corners on the organizational change management, the OCM, you significantly increased the risk of that project being less than successful. So that's kind of stuck an arrow in my quiver as far as one of the terms of reference that I use when I take a look at project proposals and so on. And do we have the right mix of OCM included in these projects?
I love it. We just, as a firm, we kind of, we were trying to sell OCM as part of our implementations. And oftentimes people were like, yep, we're really interested. The people are important. And then when the budget became tight, they were like, yeah, let's take out this OCM piece, right? And they would take it out. It'd be the first thing to go.
Right.
It was considered unnecessary. And we said, as a firm, that is unacceptable to us because we understand the value that it brings in the client success. So we essentially buried it, right? And it's now buried and built in. You can't find it. We don't declare it. it just happens. And yes, the customers pay for it, but it's to their benefit.
Hmm.
Um, and we're super excited. We have a whole bunch of ProSci certified change managers. We do all these assessments. We provide all kinds of reports, and people love it. I mean, it's hard to self look at your organization. I heard a great quote, and they said, it's hard to read the label from inside the bottle. And it was a great quote and so sometimes having some people come in and go, hey, sponsorship isn't really where it needs to be, or
Hmm.
hey, the frontline management manager levels, they're really not bought in, and we need to figure out a way to get them more involved so they
Hmm.
can champion this forward. Those are critical things that a sponsor might be blind to, or a steering committee might be blind to, that the OCM process really allows to be discovered and brought forward, and then you can fix it before you get down a path, and and have a total disconnect, and you've spent tens of millions of dollars, and now you got a big problem.
Hmm. Well, I heard a quote once, and it went something like, I hope I get it right. It was something like, "There's nothing more useless than redesigning a process that should have never existed in the first place." So, so I think, again, we're aligned around. We see a lot of people involved in activity traps and busy work, and it all takes away from the mission. And when you're very, very clear on your mission, when your people are clear, your resources are aligned, it is so easy to spot a distraction. And you recognize it as being a distraction, as opposed to getting sucked into this rabbit hole and then going on a whole other journey that takes you off topic and costs a lot of money often.
I love it. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered AI and cybersecurity and the cool world of 3D avatars and the metaverse. Um, and ERP, right, and organizational change management, things that both Gary and I do on a day to day. So, Gary, I want to thank you for taking the time, sharing your knowledge. It's great to meet somebody who's so aligned and at a different scale, perhaps is seeing the very same things that we're seeing, and which leads me just gives me great hope that we're all in it to win it for the clients together. So
Hmm.
thank you so much for taking the time. Gary's company is out at aiinc.cloud. So it's aiinc.cloud, but there's two I's in there to make sure that you get there. I'll have the link down below, and you can see the services. He has information also about the one-day SAP assessment that he referenced to me, right? To take something that takes 1 to 2 years and say, yeah, we'll do it in a day, and we'll give you even better information, is something people should pay attention to. That's pretty impactful. So, Gary, again, thank you for taking the time.
Michael, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for the